So what does graffiti like this tell us about society? Well, basically it tells us that we've raised a generation of people who have no respect for other people's property. Years ago, Peggy and I were living on a boat in a marina on Bainbridge Island. That's about 8 miles from Seattle. And in the marina there was this guy, and he was probably in his mid-40s. Pretty sharp guy, but he was pretty much full of himself. And Peggy and I were trying to talk to him about the gospel and that sort of thing. And he just kind of looked at us like we were childish misfits. And then one day, something happened. I don't remember what it was, but he says, "I should have known. The writing was on the wall." And I said, his name was Bob. And I said, "Well, Bob, you're quoting from the Bible there." And he says, What do you mean?" "Well, the writing's on the wall. That's out of the book of Daniel." And of course, he had no idea. As smart as he was, he didn't have any idea what was in the Bible. And then fast forward a few weeks, and he had a kid about 10 years old, and his kid said something profound, and he says, "Wow, out of the mouth of babes." And I said, "Well, here you are again, Bob. You don't believe in the Bible, but here you are referring to it and quoting from it." He goes, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, out of the mouth of babes. That's in the Psalms." Of course, he had no idea. And that's kind of the environment we live in a lot of our, especially our liberal towns, liberal cities, some of the blue cities. People that think they're so smart, but they don't really have a clue. And sometimes God has to use drastic measures to get people's attention. And that's what I'm going to talk about today out of the book of Daniel, chapter 5. Okay, to get a little back history on what we're about to read, the Jews, the nation of Israel, had rebelled from God, and God disciplined them at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar sent some troops down to Israel, leveled the temple, and carried off some of the upper crust of society as captives and took them back to Babylon. So fast forward a few decades here, and Daniel happened to be living there. He was one of the captives. And Belshazzar, who happened to be one of Nebuchadnezzar's sons, I believe it was. Chapter 5 says, "Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the thousands. And when Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, in order that the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines might drink from them." This is a bad idea, okay? But this guy, he's an arrogant pup. He doesn't understand the significance of what's about to happen. And so here they are getting drunked up using the holy items from the temple of Jerusalem. And then in verse 5 it says, "Suddenly the fingers of a man's hand appeared and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together." Sometimes we get criticized because oftentimes we'll take signs addressing certain cults or certain issues, gay pride parades or whatever, and we'll put some signs that address their problem, and we'll go stand in the middle of them. And it's a lightning rod, of course. You usually have lots of people to talk to if you do something like that. But sometimes Christians get this idea that God can only use the scripture to get people's attention. He can only use Bible verses. And so that's what you should be doing, is out just quoting Bible verses. Well, that isn't what God Belshazzar's attention. What got his attention was a hand scribbling something, some graffiti on his wall. And of course, he didn't have any idea what it was about. So fast forward a few verses in this same chapter, and he's seeking people to come and explain it to him. He's got all of his wise men, his astrologers, and the upper crust of his society there that are supposed to know what's going on. And eventually, nobody can figure out what it's about. So eventually, the word gets to Daniel what had happened, and some of the advisors of the king suggest that he get hold of Daniel, because Daniel happens to be somebody that understands spiritual mysteries, right? And so anyway, Daniel comes, and of course the king wants to pay him, right? And that's always a temptation whenever when you're a preacher. The devil's always going to try to buy you off. So always be careful of that. So anyway, verse 17 says, Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your father. Okay, so he's just reminding him of how he came to be who he is, the son of a king, right? Who had God had given grace to. And because of the grandeur which he bestowed upon him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed. Whomever he wished, he spared alive. Whomever he wished, he elevated. Whomever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. Okay, so here's a little warning to the kid. So fast forward a little bit. Eventually, he gets down to the interpretation. And verse 24 says, then the hand was sent from him, and his inscription was written out. Now this is the inscription that was written out, many, many tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Many, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the scale and found deficient. And then upharsin, or Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple, put a necklace of gold around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him, that he now had the authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius, the Mede, received the kingdom at about age 62. So it's passed off to Darius. So the point of the matter is, God has your number. And if you think that you're smarter than God, good luck with that.
Hallelujah to my Jesus.